Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Tim Morgan, and I'm a founder and the CTO of Deep Surface Security. I spent most of my career as an application pen tester, and now I lead a team where we're building a product to help folks with their vulnerability management programs. So today I'm here to talk to you about zero trust. So what is zero trust? What are we talking about? Well, the person that's most often quoted in the definition of zero trust is this fellow from Forrester. Almost a decade ago, they proposed an idea that really we should stop trusting our internal networks. We should stop regarding our traditional infrastructure inside of behind our firewalls as being really any more trusted than the internet itself. And that seems like kind of a radical notion, but really I think it's something that's been a long time in coming, and I'll explain why that is. But essentially another way to think about this is it's applying the principle of least privilege to network access. And we're not going to trust people simply because they live on a certain IP address range. We're going to force them to authenticate, and then we grant them access according to who they are, rather than just being a certain IP on a subnet. Why are we bringing this up again? Why are we talking about this now? Well, for one, Biden says that we need to do this. So at the highest levels of federal government, there's visibility of zero trust. That moving towards this kind of model is a better way to approach security. Whether you can get behind that or not, whether the federal government will really be able to adopt this anytime soon, it remains to be seen. But it is getting a lot more visibility. And so your upper levels of management are going to be thinking about this more. And so I think it's worth a discussion. Another reason why this is really important is actually just because of the pandemic. So the pandemic pushed a lot of people into remote work, a lot of folks who had not been in remote work before. And that really presented a lot of challenges. And initially, we were just scrambling, IT teams around the world were just scrambling to provide their employees remote access with enough VPN bandwidth and whatever else it was, remote services. And that was a really big challenge, and just getting things working was step one. But now we really need to rethink our threat model and rethink how things are going to be going forward after the pandemic is done. Really, the pandemic sped up a transition that was already happening for many years. People were becoming more and more mobile in their work, and people were expecting to be able to get more done from different places. And that's really put a strain on our traditional threat model. After the pandemic's over, it's going to have a lasting impact. We've built out a lot of infrastructure to support remote work. Users have learned how to use the internet in so many different ways in terms of how they work on a day-to-day basis. Everyone's learned how to do video conferences, whereas before a lot of people didn't have their camera working, right? And so many workers want to remain remote now. Depending on their role, they can really kind of force management to allow this. And a lot of companies, especially tech companies, are allowing this for indefinitely. So this is really a fundamental shift that's not going to go back to the way it was. So before we go forward though and talk about today, let's take a step back and look at how things used to be a really long time ago when we first devised this whole concept of an internal network. Back in maybe the 90s, imagine a time when most users, well, all of your employees were working on premises pretty much, and those who were working remotely or were on the road, they actually didn't have laptops. Imagine the days when laptops were expensive, clunky, hard to use, and even if they were used, people didn't access corporate resources while they were on the road. All they used it for was writing up Word documents or something, right? So back in that time, and it's hard to imagine today not being so reliant on the internet. Back in those days, businesses weren't that reliant on the internet. They primarily used it just to put up a website and advertise, and then all of their computing infrastructure was inside their control on their physical premises, right? So, but of course, over time that started to change. And we started to have more and more salespeople, more executives being on the road more often and wanting to be able to get their corporate email on the road. And so we had to give them things like VPNs in order to protect those communications. And that actually opened up a small hole in our perimeter, really, because if you have a laptop that is sometimes on the network over the VPN and sometimes not on the network, not on the VPN, then you're exposing that laptop to direct attack. And once they jump back on the VPN, you could put the rest of the environment at risk. But we just put antivirus on there and we just hope for the best, right? And then this transition continued where more and more employees started having good home machines, and they wanted to be able to check their email while they're at home, or occasionally they wanted to work from home. And so we needed to support that. We started having more and more problems with security. I started off in security during kind of the age of worms and the age of viruses, where you had these really rapidly spreading pieces of malware that were really dumb and unintelligent, but they would spread like wildfire because our security was so lax. And so, we have to put up our spam and antivirus at the perimeter to try to protect users from, things like I love you virus and what have you. And then continuing several years forward, we started hosting things off-site. We started putting a lot of our computing resources in co-location facilities on physical servers, but not on our premises. And that just made hosting a lot more convenient when it comes to uptime and reliability. And we also started allowing users to bring their own devices. We started allowing them onto our Wi-Fi networks. And, they're just a phone. Who's going to hack a phone, right? Well, it turns out, yeah, that is actually a problem. And so over time, we just started getting more and more perforation of our perimeter with all these different, needs for mobility, needs for access from different places. And until, fast forward until 2019, when now we've moved so many other things out to third-party services. So, we are moving them to the cloud, but we're no longer actually maintaining the servers. We're just using applications that are hosted by other companies, right? So software as a service is taking over a lot of the stuff that most employees do day to day. And in order to track that kind of communications, we have to have things like DLPs in order to make sure employees aren't uploading long lists of social security numbers to the wrong places, that sort of thing. So as you can see, like we've had to keep putting Band-Aid after Band-Aid after Band-Aid on this perimeter to make sure that we're still reasonably safe. And then the pandemic happened, and now there's hardly anybody on the internal network at all. So everyone is remote. So everyone's outside the perimeter. And because so many services are actually publicly hosted, they're not even going through the VPN to get at them. So how are you protecting those users from doing things they shouldn't be doing or from getting attacked through the, through perimeter devices when your perimeter isn't even being used for that traffic anymore? So it's completely changed. It's been a slow progression, but the pandemic has really fast forwarded us to a state where this old model makes no sense anymore. So zero trust is just the acceptance that we can only hope to secure our applications, our users, and the communications in between. It doesn't really make sense to try to secure an internal network anymore because the internal network is shrinking, and for a long time now, internal networks have been really easy to breach. So you might be skeptical still, or unsure of whether or not this is something that's going to last. But let's talk a little bit about the economics behind all this. So I'd like to compare it to the TV and video markets and how they've evolved over time, and then look side by side with the way that computing has changed. So in the beginning, we had these pieces of hardware that we really cherished. You bought a TV, and that TV was really valuable to you. You got a lot of enjoyment out of it, and the content you received was basically free. It was just over the air, right? So you didn't really put a lot of weight on the content itself or your use of the device. You put a lot of weight on the device itself. And the same thing with mainframes. If you had a multi-million-dollar mainframe in a facility, the content that you processed there would be almost all on premises. People would generate data, do data entry, enter information about your business, do all the algorithms locally, and then spit out some sort of useful calculation. There wasn't really any thought put to the software that ran on it as much as the actual hardware itself. But then, of course, over time, things started to become more democratized. In the video space, we started to see cable television be on the rise, and that allowed way more channels to be served in parallel. So that just allowed so many more stations to be created. And those started to have more and more value. People started to be able to get types of content they couldn't get before, different types of entertainment, news, and that sort of thing. And then on the computing side, computers just got really cheap, right? Things got so much cheaper than they used to be, and everyone could have their own device. And so what became more interesting in computing was, how do we get these devices talking to each other? Because now we have not one central machine, but lots and lots of little machines scattered all over the place. The value actually was in communicating with each other through those devices. And of course, some companies figured out how to capitalize on this. The cable networks figured out that they could create your little cable packages so that the first 40 channels are really cheap, but they don't have any content anybody wants. And then you have to pay a whole lot more for the next package. And for years, everyone dreamed of this idea of a la carte cable, where you could just buy just the channels you wanted. So that way you don't have to pay through the nose just to get a bunch of stations you didn't want. Of course, that never really happened, did it? And then on the computing side, we had things like Internet Explorer that took complete dominant market share of browsing for a period of time. They basically controlled how people saw the internet for a long time, how people saw the web anyway. Same thing with the App Store for Apple. When Apple was a dominant phone vendor for smartphones, the only way to get an app out to anybody was to go through them, the gatekeeper for those apps. So that kind of thing can restrict markets, but it's a kind of a phase that's just natural that a lot of these markets go through. And now things on both ends have really become a lot more democratized, even more so, but not so much on the device side of things as much as on the content side of things. So we finally do have a la carte cable, right? We can get whatever we want, paying just a few bucks a month to get specific channels, and it's incredibly cheap if you just want certain things. But then you got to manage all of it. Like, I can't remember half the time what service a certain show is on, right? Like, if I'm looking for Mr. Robot, like, is that on Prime or is that on Netflix, or do I got to go to, it's a pain in the butt. The same thing has happened on the internet, right? With all of the day-to-day business applications we're using, they're all hosted by somebody else now. You get one service one at a time, and it's very a la carte once again. So what I'm saying here is that this is just a natural transition that we're going through, and that this whole idea of zero trust is just the security people catching up with the fact that the world changed. So the new mental model that we need to use is essentially, we secure our individual workstations and whatever the user is using to access content, right? Whatever our employees are using. And we secure those independently. We should be able to put them on any network and have them be safe. And then we do the same thing with all of our applications. Those need to be cordoned off and just be really safe, and only have one application stack in any kind of trusted environment. And then we secure the communications between them. We make sure that the encryption's good, the authentication's good. And if we do that, then we can provide the kind of flexibility that people are demanding, while also continuing to keep things secure. Is it really safer though? Is taking this approach really better? Well, in my research doing risk analysis of internal networks, what I've found is that as you grow an internal network, let's say you double the size of an internal network, the amount of risk that appears is about 4 times as much. So it basically grows quadratically. And just the reason for that is just because if you have this kind of traditional model of this eggshell where, once you break in, then you can access so many different things. If you grow the size of that, the number of combinations of ways that you can hack things just grows quadratically. The number of potential internal insecure services just grows really, really rapidly. And so you end up with, it really makes sense because there's a lot of network theory behind that. So if you take that larger environment and cut it in half and segment it, then you actually could drop your risk by 4 times, right? Because you've cut it into 2 smaller pieces. And so microsegmentation is really an approach that can dramatically reduce your risk. So that's in support of zero trust, because that's essentially what we're going to be doing, is doing some sort of microsegmentation of a lot of application environments. In addition, if we are going to be able to sort of break things up into small little application stacks, then we can outsource a lot of those. And doing so can really reduce the burden on most organizations. On the downside of this, of course, is that if we're going to break up each of these little applications and secure them independently, then the natural tendency is going to be to put them on the internet and just let people access them without a VPN. which makes sense. But of course, now you could be exposing a lot of stuff to the internet that maybe you weren't before. So it is really important that the lowest layers in our protocol stacks are very safe, right? Hopefully not another heartbleed type of bug, right? Those kinds of issues we really need to avoid. Also on the downside is if we are going to be outsourcing a lot of these services, we're now going to be relying on so many more companies to be safe themselves. And there's just been a ton of breaches of large public companies, even cloud service companies. And so, we do have this kind of weakest link scenario where any one of your cloud services could lead to a major breach of your entire infrastructure if they're heavily interlinked and interdependent on each other. So there is some danger there. But once again, I don't think we have a choice. This transition's inevitable for lots of reasons. So I think it is better to just embrace it and move forward with trying to figure out how to secure things under this new kind of mental model. So does this mean we just throw everything in the cloud? Well, not exactly. For some things, it makes total sense, but there's a lot of stuff that we simply can't move there. For one thing, all of your devices that employees use, they need to be physical devices, and those things need to be secured. You can't just, get your email through telepathy, right? So, that all needs to be safe, and we need to manage that. Legacy applications might be hard to move, so you may have to keep them on premises or at least managed by your team. And then finally, there is some stuff that you simply can't put in the cloud, right? Physical infrastructure, critical infrastructure, the power grid, hospitals, all that kind of stuff needs some component in, that's on premises. You might be managing it through a cloud service, but you're still going to have something physically there. So for that kind of stuff, we can't move it out. But I still think we should be thinking about it in terms of zero trust and in terms of how we secure each of those applications independently of one another, rather than relying on a local network to just be safe, right? And not to have any bad guys on it. So here's kind of a practical step-by-step way to think through what you would need to do to move in this direction. So anytime you're, trying to set up a new service or trying to harden a service, for one, you need to approach it one service at a time, because it's just too daunting to try to change your entire environment overnight. And so in assessing each service, always consider the cloud as an option. Always consider a SaaS service to replace whatever it is you've got running. And is that going to make your life easier? Is it going to be reasonably safe to do so? And there's a lot of trade-offs there, right? And I'm not going to go through all that list, but it's something to consider. And if you can't outsource it, then hey, you've kind of solved your problem because someone else is managing it for you. But if not, then each of these on-premises services need to be segmented and secured in place individually, right? So for a given application, who needs access and at what level? And is there currently any access being granted simply due to the fact that the person's on the local network? And if so, that needs to be rethought, right? You need to rethink how you're actually granting that access. How do you authenticate users and then grant them that only, in that way? And obviously, we need to be using single sign-on and centralized identity management in order to grant users access. We're already doing that in a lot of places. But another piece of that that's more challenging, which I'll talk about more in a minute, is how do we actually track what access rights a user has within each application? So single sign-on is great and all to identify a user and to grant them access to log into an application, but once they're in, what access do they have within that? And how do we manage all that? That can be pretty challenging. And then finally, we need good communications. We need good protocols. And it's perfectly adequate just to use TLS for things. But if you have a legacy application that's still using, SMB within TLM, then that's just not going to work. On most internal networks, so many of the protocols are so badly configured and so unsafe, just because there's a lot of trust put on that internal environment aspect of things, and we need to abandon that. If it's a protocol or a configuration you wouldn't put on the internet, then you need to abandon that and move towards something that you would put on the internet, even if you're not going to. It needs to be good enough to be put on the internet. So good certificates, good credentials, good algorithms, all that kind of stuff. And while you're going through this process of considering each application, under a zero trust sort of lens, then it really makes sense to build a threat model and incident analysis plan. So first of all, really basic question: how sensitive is the application's data? How much time should I spend on trying to lock this thing down and isolate it from other applications that might have more or less sensitive data? How do you recover if one of your employees' credentials is compromised? So it may not happen within that application, but if your one of your users gets phished and all of that, the credentials are stolen, then how do you ensure that the attacker didn't get into that application or what they accessed when they got in there? How do you recover? Like, whatever the application is, think about those scenarios and work out what your checklist ought to be in that situation. That's really helpful if you're in the middle of a breach and everybody's hair on fire about it and you need to work out what to do. And you should also consider how to recover if the hosting platform itself is compromised, which of course is a worst case scenario, but for any given application stack. But certainly you want a way to recover. And if you can make that recovery less painful, then it's much easier to recover from things like a ransomware attack where the machines are no longer available. And of course, along those lines, backups. You have backups, right? Did you test your backups? Have you ever tried to restore from those backups? How often do you do that? So many incidents that I've been involved in with investigations, people just didn't have good backups. They didn't know how to restore. It took weeks to figure out how to get the backups back, or the backups are not old enough. And the attacker may have planted back doors, and the oldest copies of backups that the company had may have been tampered with, right? So it's really important to have good backups and think that through as part of your threat model. Okay, so a lot of that can be really challenging depending on the situation. And I know that sounds like really difficult to take on. And part of the reason for that is we have crappy tools. Honestly, in a lot of situations, we don't have the tools we need to be able to do secure application deployments. So 3 areas where I think we're pretty weak in this new model is with cryptography, the ability to track access management across lots of different applications, and the lack of general auditing in most applications. So let me dig into each of these a little bit more. So when it comes to cryptography, we need to do a really good job of encryption in transit. Once again, we're going to start treating our internal network as if it is no more secure than the internet, which means all of those communications need to be encrypted just as well as if they were on the internet. So first of all, the biggest problem is automation of key management. We now have this thing called Let's Encrypt, which allows anyone with a domain name to obtain an SSL certificate from the Let's Encrypt folks in an automated way. It rotates keys every few months, and they did this over the internet without any authentication. There are risks with Let's Encrypt, but considering the deployment scenario, this is great. I mean, this is a really good way to automate your key management. Why can't we do that on internal networks? Why can't we do that through Active Directory? Why is that not already done? When you go add a computer to the domain, why not just issue a certificate at that moment? We already have a trust store, which is whatever keys are stored for Kerberos and all that other jazz. Why not just make that a CA and make that a CA by default? And every time that you join, it's just done for you. And why do Windows admins have to configure any of that? They shouldn't. They should just come with it. That's the kind of approach that we need in order to manage all this, because we're going to have to be issuing a whole lot more certificates in a zero trust model, and every single protocol needs to be encrypted in some way, and that's probably going to mean a whole lot of TLS, right? Another thing that I think we need is cryptography that's much better about resisting lateral escalation after initial breach. So what I mean by that is just somebody compromises a machine, they take root or local system on a server. What we need to do now is prevent that attacker from easily getting a hold of other people's credentials, easily getting a hold of database credentials, easily getting a hold of domain credentials of other users in the environment. because that's exactly how they're going to move within the environment to get access to something really sensitive. So as it stands right now, most people are still using passwords everywhere. Internal services aren't using two-factor auth, and it's at least most of them aren't. And once an attacker takes a local system, they just need to wait a little while until somebody logs in or until an application interacts with the machine or whatever, and then they're able to move. But contrast that with a really simple mechanism for authentication that has been around a very long time, SSH public-private key pairs. Suppose you configure a server so that it's using SSH public-private keys, and an attacker takes complete control over that Linux machine, and then could install any malware they want, could even modify the SSH service itself. And if a user logs into that machine using their public-private key pair, there's nothing that the attacker can take from that to compromise any other machines. They don't get a hold of the private key. They don't get a hold of any password. There's nothing the attacker can use to move laterally, at least for that step of the authentication. Now, if the user instead logs in using a password, all bets are off. They're screwed. The password is going to be stolen, and the attacker can simply use that to log into other machines and move laterally, right? So that's a huge difference in terms of how we use our protocols and how we authenticate to things. Certainly using two-factor authentication also mitigates that if you do a really good job with that second factor. But two-factor auth isn't perfect. People can steal, random codes that get emailed. People can steal the ones that get sent via text message. That kind of stuff. It is possible to actually man in the middle of that and to use them at least one time, maybe not persistently, but at least one time. Whereas something like a public-private key pair can actually protect you ongoing. So those are the kinds of things, like we already have the technology to do this. We just don't have the good tools to do it. And most people don't have a good understanding of how to use those tools, even if they were available. Finally, something we need on the cryptography side is stuff that resists downgrade attacks. So protocols that even if you support multiple older protocols, an attacker can't force someone to use those older ones if both sides support newer ones. So let me give you some examples here. So in the Windows world, when you're dealing with SMB and NTLM and Kerberos and all these other authentication mechanisms that come in those environments, it's really common to have many different older protocols available simply for backward compatibility. And the problem is, if an attacker is on the network and they're modifying traffic in real time, they can pretty much always force a client or a server or both to use an older protocol. There's no way for either side to know a priori which protocols the other side uses before they go and ask, right? And so the attacker can always force them to use the weak protocol and then attack the weak protocol. It turns out you can actually prevent that if you bake the right logic into your protocols. And in fact, we've had that since SSL 2.0. That's right, SSL 2.0 actually had a downgrade prevention mechanism built into it, so that during the handshake, it would basically do a little check, and then after the handshake and after the authentication was established, it would do another check, and it would determine if the attacker had downgraded the user during the handshake process. And that turned out to be a problem, so browsers promptly turned that off. So you ended up with this great, well-designed protocol, and then no one's using that, and so people could still downgrade you from, you say, SSL3 or TLS1 down to SSL2 again. And then finally later, browser manufacturers, they saw the light, and now I think with TLS3, they actually are going to enforce that downgrade prevention again. That's the kind of stuff we need, though. I mean, it's very doable. The technology is there. We need to start adopting mechanisms that prevent those kinds of issues. And so that way, when we come out with new, better protocols in the future, new versions of TLS, new versions of whatever it is, then attackers can't force us to go use something awful like an NTLM authentication process. Okay, pop quiz. Suppose we have a service that uses SSL TLS and has a trusted certificate. So we've got a good certificate installed on it. However, it is vulnerable to all of these man-in-the-middle attacks. Okay, there's all kinds of different attacks have occurred against TLS in the past, in the recent past. And all of them have certain impacts. So let's say this particular service is vulnerable to these 5 different issues. Now contrast that with service B that has a self-signed certificate, but isn't vulnerable to any of those protocol flaws. True or false? Service B is more secure. What do you think? I'll give you a second. Well, it turns out that's completely false. If you're using a self-signed certificate and a client can't determine if that certificate is valid, then there's no point in using TLS or SSL at all. It's completely useless because an attacker can simply provide another of their own self-signed certificates. The client doesn't know that that's good or not, perform the man-in-the-middle attack, view all of the traffic that's going between both the client and the server, and they can modify all of that traffic all they want. So they basically have complete control over that protocol stream. And it's just like using HTTP with no TLS. These other protocol flaws, they are exploitable in the same kind of scenario where the attacker is on the network and they're modifying traffic in real time, but it only gives the attacker the ability to see really small pieces of data, either to decrypt it or to modify small pieces of the actual unencrypted protocol stream. It doesn't allow the attacker to exploit, run arbitrary code on either end or anything like that. Basically, all of these vulnerabilities are just highly publicized because they affected so many people, not because they were so earth-shatteringly bad, right? They're bad, but look at any internal network and a huge number of services have bad certificates. So like, who cares, right? The certificates are the important thing. You got to get those things right. So I think one way that some changes that we need to make in order to adopt something like zero trust is that everybody needs to get a whole lot better at understanding their crypto. And I don't mean understanding the differences between AES 128 and 256. I don't mean really low level algorithm stuff. I mean the basics of how you manage certificates. How do you create your own CA? How do you generate those certificates for servers safely? How do you generate client certificates? How do you install those on the various services that you need to use them? How can you automate that entire process? For one thing, I think everyone needs to understand man-in-the-middle attacks a little bit better when it comes to certificates. So that way they'll understand why it is that we need to do this. And then finally, you need to know the tools, right? You need to know the basic stuff that allows you to automate certificate distribution, to test your configurations, and really just to get every internal service using a safe certificate. There's no reason we can't do this. It's just engineering work. It's not crazy crypto work. We just need better tools. And I think everyone from sysadmins to programmers and everybody in between needs to have, if you work in a technical discipline, needs to have a much better understanding of how certificates work and just do it. Okay, enough about crypto for a moment. Another area where I think we're going to have a lot of trouble is access control management. So it's one thing to have a central server that provides identity for your users, basically is able to prove who everyone is when they log into this diverse set of third-party services, or on-premise services and third-party services. But it's another thing to say, okay, given any given user account, what access do they have to everything right now? Can they get at any database servers? Can they get into certain sensitive files in Dropbox? What access do they have? We basically need some kind of central console to tell us which, what access any given user has at any given time. And that's going to be really tough because, of course, you're dealing with a ton of different vendors. So I think there needs to be better standards in this area so that that information can be better communicated to products that can kind of centrally manage it. And it's just going to be very challenging. And I don't really have any answers to this, but I do see it as a big outstanding issue. If you are a developer and you're developing an access control for your own application, I do have a few tips, a few suggestions. Number one, don't over-engineer it. So in other words, if you've got a web application, a SaaS web application or something, where you've got a number of different user roles, and administrators, your customers want to be able to control access rights within your web application, it's really tempting to go in and just do really, really fine-grained controls where you've got, oh yeah, 15 different little checkboxes to dictate which access level somebody has, and then associate those with objects in the system or records or whatever, and then group those into roles, and then allow roles to be inside roles, and then allow users to be directly connected to all those privileges, and have a really, really rich role-based access control system that gives you complete flexibility and lets you do anything that you would want to do with access rights. Don't do it. It's too much. What I found over and over again is if your access control system is too complex, people won't use it. You see that in a lot of places. You look at the permissions of applications installed on Linux by default, and they tend to be very well locked down and very safe for the most part, because they're extremely simple to understand. You look at NTFS on Windows, and you look at the default permissions on a lot of stuff, and it's usually really, really permissive, really, really unsafe. And I think part of that is because of the complexity of NTLM access permissions. The whole inheritance model that they have, the ability to do all kinds of crazy associations between users and groups. It just gets really overwhelming for the novice, and especially if you're, let's say you're a Linux developer and you're porting your application to Windows, you were probably going to screw up the permissions, when your application gets installed, because there's a lot of stuff you don't know about. So I think it is important to keep it simple. Keep it as simple as you possibly can, sort of Occam's razor approach. The minimal amount of flexibility needed to achieve what's desired for your users, right? How does your access control system work? Like, what is your access control model? Do you have a matrix that breaks down what access should be allowed given a certain role or certain permission? Have it documented. When I was doing application pen testing, I found maybe only a quarter of all of my customers who had built their own custom applications had actually documented their access control system. In other words, they didn't have any document they could show me that said, if you're in this role, you should have access to these 5 things. They didn't have anything broken down. And that's really, really common. And that's pretty alarming, right? Because if they don't even have that documented, they can't tell customers who has access to what, let alone do a good job of a pen test internally, because the pen tester only has a week to figure all this stuff out, and they're just going to have to guess at who should have access to things. So anyway, that's a pet peeve of mine, but it is really important to have a good, clear understanding of how things should work, communicate that well to customers, as well as be able to do testing against it. And then finally, if you've got a customer who is able to configure permissions within your application, then how do they determine what that access really means, right? So if I go into Dropbox and I'm an administrator and I just want to look at Larry's account, how do I know which files Larry has access to? Is there a simple report for this? What if I disable Larry's account because Larry's password just got stolen? Do I have an easy way to go in and find out what access Larry has? In some applications, it's really hard. In some applications I've seen, you have to actually log in as that user and just start clicking around to find out what they could have accessed, what the attacker could have accessed in a breach scenario. And that's going to make it really hard for your customers to deal with security incidents. Okay. And then finally, I just want to note a few things about auditing. Most applications are really immature in this area, and it's hard. I mean, I know I build software. It is hard to be able to provide all these capabilities. But on the flip side, when I've been involved in investigations, I found that computers log surprisingly little. They really track very little information about what events have occurred in the past. And it really does feel like you're like this little image where you're actually trying to track someone based on their footprints on the beach and it's high tide. There might be some evidence left behind of what an attacker did when they broke into something, but it's very ephemeral and it's very limited, and it's not going to be there very long. And so it's very difficult to build a good, clear picture of what happened during a breach. And I guarantee you the vast majority of investigators that have to give reports on what happened during a breach, they have to fudge it a lot because there's just not enough information there. Whether it be Windows event logs, logs on a Linux server, web application logs. I mean, just consider if an attacker was exploiting a SQL injection vulnerability against a web application, and the web logs do record when somebody sends requests to a particular endpoint, right? You're going to see there's requests in the log. But if an attacker exploited that bug through a post request, the values in the post request are not recorded on most web servers. So you have no idea what attack they're conducting, right? All you know is that somebody from this IP address, which by the way is just a hacked machine, so there's no information to that. Somebody from some IP address was hitting a machine on a certain endpoint, and you have no idea why they did 10,000 requests, but they were probably doing something. It's really hard to know what actually happened. And so anytime as an application developer, you can provide better auditing. What did a user do when? What pages did they access? What kind of actions did they take? And actions more at a logical level rather than at the nuts and bolts level of like, I saw a request from a browser, you know. Anything you can do to track that better and protect those logs, even in the case of a breach, that's going to be really helpful for folks going forward, for your customers to understand how they can secure accounts after they've been hacked and that sort of thing. Okay, another pop quiz. So I talked a little bit before about SSH public-private key pairs. So let's consider, again, a Linux server where I'm disallowing password authentication entirely. Users are not allowed to log in with passwords, period. They can only log in if they've been have their public key installed on the machine. True or false? This configuration prevents man-in-the-middle attacks even if the SSH client can't verify the server's host key. So you know that time when you log into a server for the very first time and SSH says, oh, I see this key I've never seen before. Do you want to trust it? At that moment, you can't trust that host key. You have no way to know if that's actually the real server or if it's an attacker trying to man in the middle of your traffic, okay? So if we're using public-private key pairs, is it true or false that an attacker can't man in the middle of that session? Turns out it's true. It's a little bit surprising, but as it turns out, the way the Diffie-Hellman exchange happens with SSH is that both the client key, client public key, and the server key are both signing that Diffie-Hellman exchange. And if only one of them is trustworthy, and in this case, the client's public-private key pair is trustworthy because the server can verify it, then that handshake can be made safe. And an attacker can't actually determine what the session key is after the handshake finishes. At least that's based on my research. So actually, if we just use public-private key pairs, we can simplify the key distribution of server keys, right? Because if all we ever allow is the public-private key pairs, then administrators install those. Of course, they're tracking what the valid key is for every user in the environment. And so then actually things are a lot simpler. So we can use crypto to make our lives easier. We really can if we think it through and if we understand the crypto better. Okay, so just a few final thoughts to wrap it up. If you're a fan of the principle of least privilege, well, you know, zero trust is just a new way of looking at it, right? It's a new way of applying the principle of least privilege to your internal network. And certainly zero trust probably sounds like a buzzword, and it is a buzzword, but it's also a useful tool to communicate a more modern approach to architecting systems. And in addition, you can turn zero trust around and not really treat it as a security mechanism as much as it is a way to make your employees more effective. Right? So if you do adopt zero trust, it's a whole lot easier to just put a lot of services up on the web and allow your employees to access them from anywhere. So working remotely is no longer a barrier to hiring someone. You know, that can really be a nice benefit for management, and you can really sell it that way by you know, looking at it from that direction. So I included just a few tools and resources in this slide deck, which I'll share with the OWASP folks. I'm sure they'll get it out to you. And so a lot of the stuff I already covered. There are some tools in here you might find interesting, like using a Let's Encrypt-like approach with your own internal network. Essentially, the ACME protocol is the protocol Let's Encrypt uses. And so there's a few tools that people are already have already built to allow you to do that on an internal network. And then just some background information. All right, thank you very much. And I think we'll open up for questions now.